Hello, lovely people. I am back with another book chat, the regular roundup of stuff I've read at some point in my past. I've got a whole bunch of books to talk about. We're not going to dilly-dally any further.
Sophie Vlogs.
So, I will kick off with a reread pairing that I did. So I reread both How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu and Jane Unlimited by Kristen Cashore because I kind of fancied like a little sci-fi moment, and I really, really enjoyed both of these when I first read them, but it's been a number of years. And the lens I was going for was sort of things that are playing around with time travel and timelines and that kind of thing. I will focus on this one first. So How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu is a book that follows a character called Charles Yu, who is a time machine repairman, and essentially he gets stuck in a loop when he accidentally shoots his future self, and then he dives into his little pod and sort of gets trapped in this little loop thing. The thing I remember the most about this and why I really liked it is there is like a thread running throughout this that is essentially Charles has an estranged father. When he was a child and a teenager, his father was trying to build a time machine. It wasn't successful, but at some point his father sort of disappeared. And so what I like most about this book is the aspect of the plot that is kind of exploring that relationship. It is posited within this world where people can time travel, but really it is like a hurt child trying to connect and find his dad. And there are so many things about the way that that is done that I really liked. I will link below. I did a standalone review of this where I quoted some of my favourite passages from it, so I will link that down below in case you want to listen to it. Upon a reread, I still really liked that element. Number one, took a lot longer to get to this point than I remembered. Like half the book is just him like being a time travel repairman and like in his little pod and interacting with his little fake dog and all that kind of thing. Didn't love that bit so much. Did reduce my rating from a 4 stars to a 3 stars just because there was more of this that I thought was fine but didn't really draw me in than I remembered. But that's totally fine, and that's why a reread is sometimes interesting. Jane Unlimited by Kristen Cashore, however, bumped up from 4 stars to 5 stars. I love this so much because it's riffing off of all the things I love. So we follow Jane, and essentially her Aunt Magnolia has died, and her Aunt Magnolia made her promise before her death that if she was ever invited to this island called Two Rivières, then she would go. And so she bumps into the girl who lives there, who they used to know each other. She gets invited, she goes. You follow her until a point, and at that point she can choose between following one of 5 people, and then the narrative splits, and we get to see the reality of what would have happened depending on who she followed. This is playing with genre so much. Every single one of these different realities is like riffing off of a different genre. There's like heists, but then also we get steadily weirder as it goes. Like it gets very sci-fi. Rereading this was a delight, because I picked up, before the narrative splits, I picked up on so many things which, when you know how each narrative goes, they have so much more meaning than when you're just reading this the first time and you're like, okay, so interesting, don't know why that's relevant, interesting, don't know why that's relevant. I understand why they're all relevant, and it was just a delight to see all of these little things peppered throughout. This is also riffing off of one of my favourite books, which is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, because obviously the island is called Two Rivières, which is a reference to the boat that Rebecca had in that book, but also there are so many little nods, both in terms of character names, but also some plot threads, and it's the same with Jane Eyre, because in some ways Rebecca is riffing off of Jane Eyre, let's be honest. But there are so many Jane Eyre nods in this as well, like there is a mad woman in the attic, but in a very different way. All of this kind of thing. This delighted me to my very soul, and it is one of my favourite books, and I loved it so much, and I would recommend it so deeply. After that, I need to talk about a book that I keep forgetting to talk about. I read A Very British Murder by Lucy Worsley for Non-Fiction November. Did I remember to talk about it in my Non-Fiction November wrap-up? No, I did not, and then it was now. So, I wanted to just mention that I read it and I enjoyed it. I thought when I picked it up that it was a look at I was like, oh, how exactly are we classing like a murder as being British? Like, let's look at that. Actually, it's sort of looking at murder, but how like murder, mystery and crime novels developed. So essentially she starts you off at this point of time when murders became more sensationalized due to the printing press and that kind of thing. And so a lot more people would be aware when these crimes were committed than previously, when it's just like everyone in the town that it happened knows, but no one else really does. The printing press and newspapers becoming more affordable, and then this thing becomes more sensationalized, and then people start to want to consume things about murders. And then she kind of looks at historical events that happened and their influence upon crime fiction. One warning is that she does a lot of summarizing book plots, which, like, I'd just read The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, but if I hadn't, she tells you the whole thing, the twists, the turns. So I would like to give a small warning about that, because there were some portions of this which I kind of just skimmed because they were books that are on my TBR that I want to read without having them spoiled. So I'd like to just, that's one of the reasons why I didn't give it a higher rating. I gave it a 3. Because that was frustrating. And I understand that in some ways you need to do that to illustrate the points you're making, but I just felt like there was quite a lot of this that was just describing book plots to me. The stuff that was to do with, like, actual history and how that is reflected in the books that were published at the time, super interesting. I really like Lucy Worsley. I find her very easy to read. I would still recommend this, but I do want to do that caveat of being like, tread carefully in regards to spoilers. After that is The True Queen by Zen Cho. This is the second book in, I don't know what this series is called, but the first book was Sorcerer to the Crown. This is kind of like a Regency era inspired fantasy. This is following different characters to the first book, although we do sort of like loop back to those people at some point. So we're following Muna, who, her and her sister, Sakti, they've like woken up. They know who they are, and they know that they're sisters, but they don't know anything else. So we have the return of a character from the first book who I love, which is Mak Gang, and she kind of takes them in and is sort of helping them. They've very clearly been cursed, but they're trying to find out by who, how to break the curse. So we have, the start of this is in Janzabaik, and I really enjoyed that setting and getting a better glimpse of Mak Gang and her presence, where she is from, and the politics of that place. That was super fabulous. We do eventually come to England, where we loop back up with the characters from the first book. I really enjoy Zen Cho. She's becoming a favourite author because I really like the variety of things that she writes. She always is playing with really interesting ideas, and I like how she executes them. This particular book, there's mysteries to do with what is the origin of these girls. There's also this thing that goes missing from Fairyland that is causing some problems. I personally thought that the answers to those mysteries were quite obvious. It didn't ruin my enjoyment. You know when it's like, I see the fact that she as an author is signposting little hints, but there you're just like, that's the hint, that means this is the thing. So like, everything I predicted was true, but I still enjoyed the process of reading it and finding it. There's also a sapphic romance in this, which I definitely felt the threads of as we were reading. It's definitely quite subtle, but also I feel like in a similar way to the romance of the first book. I felt like it had a similar amount of presence, where you kind of like get some vibes, and then at the end, like, conversations are had, things are acknowledged, romance, woohoo. But I enjoyed the love interest for Muna is a character who is in the first book who doesn't have such a big presence, and I did enjoy her having more of a presence here. The sisterly relationship between Sakti and Muna was really interesting because they are very different people, and there is like deep love there and care for each other while also butting heads because they are very different. I just really enjoy this world. It does like look at examining concepts like in this Regency society where it's incredibly frowned upon for white women to engage with magic, why is it that Muna, when she arrives in society, is a sensation, and how this society, like, others people and all this kind of thing. So, like the first book, there are threads like that run throughout it. I just really like this series. For something completely different, I also read The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. I think this edition is delightful. I thought this book was delightful. I remember the animated Wind in the Willows series from when I was a child, but the only sort of plot element of that I remember is the very climax of this book. So I sort of just read this in like a delightful, essentially, I watched a program on S4C which was about little snuffly creatures like badgers and moles and that sort of stuff living underground. And I was like, you know what I want to read? I want to read Wind in the Willows. I got too attached. I'm too attached to Molly as a person. This is very, like, some people might find this boring because, like, not a huge amount happens. But what I enjoyed was just sort of like pottering along with these little animals. Like, Molly ventures into the deep dark woods and it gets a bit bothersome, and then Badger has to come to the rescue. Like, that was the level of like strife that I felt comfortable with at the time that I read this, and I just found it so sweet. The descriptions of nature are beautiful, the relationships between these animals are interesting. I definitely feel like you could look at this through like a class lens, like Toad as upper class versus like Moley and Ratty and that kind of thing. Like, I'm sure that someone has done a massive essay that is all about like class in Wind in the Willows, but I would read it. It would be interesting to me. I just found this sweet and lovely and adorable, and there were like real moments that touched me. Like, there's a bit when Moley, like, he suddenly realizes how long he's been away from home, and he's just like torn and wrenched, and then they have like his homecoming, like all of these things like got me too emotional, and I was like, why am I so emotional about a mole returning to his hole? But I was. A book that I loved that I read on Kindle is Black and British by David Olusoga. This is a tome. It's like 700 and something pages. So it took me like a solid month to read, but I loved it insofar as it is so well put together and it shines such a light on aspects of history that you are not taught about that it was utterly brilliant. First chapter is looking at Roman era and like the presence of black people in Britain then. We go through time. As you might expect, there's quite a lot of time spent on Britain and its role in slavery, and the amount of information in this that I had never ever heard before. Like, I read a fair number of history things. I consider it an interest. I took history at school. Was I ever given visibility on any of these things? No. So I just think that even though I know I'm not going to remember every exact detail that was in this book because it was a bit of a tome, I feel like the knowledge that has been imparted to me is so valuable. I felt like it was written so well. Like, it was so big, but I never felt lost. Like, I always felt really grounded in it, and I feel like he writes extremely well. I've watched a number of David Olusoga's programs, so I know that I like him as a presenter, and it was interesting to read him as a writer. I just cannot recommend this book enough. There is a smaller version of this book that I believe is aimed towards like a YA audience, could be used like in teaching in schools, and I think that's brilliant. Potentially, if this is a topic that you would like to explore further but you're not ready to tackle such a big book, definitely look into that version of it because the information is so worth knowing. It was so good. Just to change genre again wildly, this is Heartless by Gail Carriger, which is the fourth book in the Alexia Tarabotti universe. My mum has lent me like all of these, so they're going to be popping up a lot. I have so many of them. This is this sort of steampunk world. We follow Alexa, who is a preternatural, which means that in this world where you have like ghosts, werewolves, and vampires, her touch nullifies any supernatural. So supernatural people have too much soul, but she has no soul. At this point, it's very hard to talk about what's happening without spoiling things. I will say, I thought this was perfectly fine. I found it slightly less exciting than some of the other books in the series. I felt like for the first half of the novel, Alexa is trying to figure out this ghost has appeared and given her this warning, and she's trying to figure out what exactly it means. And the first sort of half of this, she's following a thread that is not the thread that is actually true. So, and then the second part, we really kick into action, and the crescendo is like very fast-paced. I did still appreciate the first half because it shed light on some previous history that has been only nodded towards. We got a real exploration of like Professor Lyle's backstory and stuff like that, so I did appreciate those things. It definitely felt like a book of two halves to me. Another thing is that there is one of my favourite characters in the series does some things towards the end that I feel like are very emotion-led in a way that I'm not quite sure. I feel like this character would have thought through her actions a bit more, but they apparently didn't. So this is still a book series that I am like enjoying. I'm having a fun time reading it. It's sort of fun to do as like a light-hearted steampunk romp. It's not my favourite. And I probably wouldn't read all of the series if I hadn't already been lent to me. Like, I wouldn't go out of my way to buy it, but I'm going to continue reading it because I have so many of them. But yeah, if you like fun steampunk little like drabbles, definitely one to check out. And finally, I know I've talked about so many books in this, I'm trying to keep it concise. I just want to talk about Exhalation by Ted Chiang, which is a short story collection that is like science fiction short stories. I've read Stories of Your Lives and Others by Ted Chiang before, and I loved it. This one I also found great. He has such brilliant ideas, and he really does like take a concept as a start point and then just zoom out and expand upon it and just explore it in this way that makes you think so deeply about humanity and but also at the same time there always is kind of like an element of hope, I feel, in these short stories that I really appreciate. One thing I love as well is that at the end there is a little bit where he runs through what the inspirations for each short story was, and that was again fascinating. He has written so many of his short stories are just like, they live in my brain rent free. Every now and then I think about them and I think about like the implications and the repercussions, and I just have so many feelings about them. His short story is the basis for the film Arrival, if that gives you any idea. I would recommend him so much if you like science fiction, and particularly science fiction that leans on the science. Like, a lot of these short stories are either like exploring, I don't know, like ramifications of technology, like AI, but in like a way I've never really thought about before, or like scientific principles, like what if this thing was true? Like, there's one short story that's the concept of like, okay, in the 1600s, our understanding of the world as being like created by God for the purposes of us, what if that was true? What would that world look like? Fascinating. That's everything I want to talk about this week. I feel like I've been quite snappy because I'm recording this on my lunch break, so I can't waffle for too long. I would love, love, love to hear your thoughts on any of these books. Please do leave me a comment down below if you fancy it. Otherwise, hope you're having the loveliest of days, and I will see you next time for something different.